Hello, this is Mike Swanson. This is a segment of the Past American Century. Got a very special guest with me today. I'm speaking with Dr. Walt Brown, Ph.D. How you doing today, Walt?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Everybody out there in Troop Land is good?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I actually did an interview a few weeks ago with Chuck Ocelli about the Kennedy assassination, and I asked him, out of all the books and authors and historians out there, what's the number one thing he would recommend? And he said your chronology. And then I thought about it, and I said, well, actually, I think your Kennedy execution might be the one thing that's come closest to actually solving the case.
Well, thank you. There's a symbiotic relationship there. And by the way, I've been on Chuck's show, and before he moved down south, he spent a few Kennedy get-togethers in my living room. So we certainly know each other, and he's done a lot of good work. The chronology, which I spent 7.5 years with 40 days off, it had to be thorough, and I made very sure it was thorough. And when all was said and done, a number of people said, "Wow, I'm going to get it. I'm going to go through it." Probably not in its entirety, but the juicier parts certainly. And they said, "Could you somehow put together a synopsis or an epilogue?" And I thought, how do you condense 32,000 pages? I mean, if you cut 2/3 of it out, you still have 10,000 pages.
Right.
So I gave it a lot of time and a lot of thought, and that's when I came up with the Kennedy execution, which what I tried to do was frame Kennedy's presidency in the historical perception of the United States up until that time. You can't compare him to Bill Clinton, but up to that point in time, where was the American presidency? What was it about? What was it doing? What was it not doing? Strengths, weaknesses, what all? And then from there, and owing a debt of thanks to your book, The War State, seeing what the American military tradition was, because we didn't have an American military tradition essentially until 1945. If the Revolutionary War has been romanticized in pictures where all the Continental soldiers are wearing nice blue uniforms, but that's absolute fiction. The War of 1812 was a disaster, but we claimed victory. The Civil War was just an atrocity. The Spanish-American War was something of a joke along the lines of the Mexican War. World War I, we made a huge difference, but as soon as the troops came home, they got sent home. And we wanted nothing to do with the peace settlement. About the only thing we did with respect to the peace settlement was Woodrow Wilson chased the Japanese delegates out. And they remembered that on December 7th of 41. He had no use for anybody but Caucasians. So when Hitler comes to power and starts flexing his muscles, we had no army whatsoever. And what we had, they were marching up and down with almost cardboard rifles. They couldn't fire them. It was just a piece of wood or a long piece of cardboard, so they learned how to do a left turn and a right turn. But luckily for the American economy, the Japanese Navy showed up over Pearl Harbor, and we got out of the Depression in about 6 hours. And then we went into the kind of production that absolutely boggled the minds of the leaders. When you and I talked recently, as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, the Russians suddenly had an ally that they desperately needed, because they needed a second front. They needed material. And they immediately came to us for 30,000 tons of aluminum so they could keep turning out the number of airplanes that they were turning out, because their Air Force was destroyed in the first week of the German attack. And right on down, millions of rifles, tens of millions of cartridges, right on down to 30,000 amputation saws. And everything that they needed, we were turning out. We were sending them Jeeps, Dodge trucks, Sherman tanks, which they didn't particularly care for because they weren't as good as the T-34s. But we were just an industrial giant because of military production. The biggest building anywhere in the world in 1943 was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where American scientists were trying to separate radioactive isotopes of uranium from raw uranium. And they used 14,000 pounds of silver, because that's the best metal for electrical conductivity as of 1943. And all they got out of this massive building, and in 1943, that building used 1/7 of all the electricity in the United States.
That's amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah, and all they got out of it was 5 pounds of uranium that they could cook. So they went to other methods. Carte blanche, money was no object, because we had suspicions that the Germans were working on a bomb. They might as well have one because they had the rockets. And we just kept going, and all of a sudden, it's August of 45, September 2nd, the Japanese ambassadors go aboard the USS Missouri, surrender. Well, what are we going to do, fellas? We got all this good stuff, and the world thinks we're now the world's biggest military power. We can't let that foot go. And we got into Korea because it was something to do. And, we were all over the planet in the 50s, either boots on the ground or overflights, the last of which was Gary Powers in 1960, and absolutely sabotaged any opportunity there was for peace to break out at the Paris summit meeting, because Khrushchev, interesting story, Khrushchev had come to the United States in 1959, but we don't know who invited him.
Huh.
Somebody went into Eisenhower's office after he came off the 18th fairway and said, Mr. President, Chairman Khrushchev has accepted the invitation to visit the United States. And Eisenhower was aghast. Who invited him? And he was invited. And he accepted. And we couldn't very well say, gee, it was a mistake. He didn't get the memo. So, sure enough, Khrushchev came over, and he was a little bit put out because we took him out to a cornfield in Iowa, and he thought, well, I can see that in Russia. We didn't let him go to Disney because they were afraid somebody was going to hide in the roller coaster and shoot him. He went on a sound stage with Shirley MacLaine, who was making Can-Can, and, it was pretty neat for him, but officially he called it Hollywood pornography. And eventually, he and Eisenhower got to Camp David, and they had some serious talks. And what came out of it was the realization that the only thing that could really save the planet from utter destruction would be a firm commitment by the United States and the Soviet Union for peace. And not just words, but words and deeds. And that's where it's at. And Alan Dulles, who was later later in charge of the President's Commission that was named after Earl Warren. Dulles, who was really the chairperson of that get-together, he went to Ike and said, look, if peace is going to break out with this Paris summit in the middle of May, we need one or two more overflights over Russia to find out what they really have, because we got to know.
Well, and at the time,
there's all kinds of things going around. Stuart Symington stood up in the Senate and said, by the end of 1960, the Russians will have 3,000 ICBMs ready to fire at us. And somebody, I think it was Andrew Goodpaster, told Ike, and Ike said, what? Get a hold of Dulles. He said, he passed that on to Dulles, and he said, what do you think the Russians have? He said, we think the Russians might be able to have 15 missiles by 1962, which is a huge difference from 3,000 in 1960. So Dulles asked for 2 more flights over the Soviet Union, because he said if peace breaks out, we can never have another overflight, because it's an act of war. So Eisenhower reluctantly agreed. He said, but it's got to be in April. Well, Gary Powers wound up going in May, and there are a number of kinds of evidence that really suggest the whole thing was sabotage.
Well, if I remember correctly, didn't Powers claim that afterwards? Years later?
Yes, years later, when he was off the CIA path, because he was getting paid $30,000 a year, and he got paid for his couple of years in Russian prison, and then he got assigned in McLean, Virginia, to sit at a desk and count pencils, and he got bored with it after a while. But he was getting $30,000 a year, and I can tell you, $30,000 in 1960 was a fortune. A school teacher in 1960 would be thrilled if they were getting paid $3,500.
Well, one thing people...
Powers took his time, and he didn't know all of the factors that were weighed against him, but he knew some of them. And the May Day celebration in Red Square was all about peace. There were peace signs all over. They didn't rattle a rocket the way they used to do. They released all kinds of doves as a sign of peace. And then all of a sudden, there's a gathering up on top of Lenin's tomb. And the American ambassador was looking at it and thinking, I wonder what's going on up there. Well, a couple days later, he found out. And we put out ridiculous stories about the plane being missing over Turkey when, in fact, it was missing over Yekaterinburg, which was where the Tsar and his family had been killed. And that's like saying we think the plane is somewhere over San Diego, but actually it was shot down over Albany, New York. And Powers was alive, but the Russians didn't mention that until we looked like fools. So Eisenhower went to the summit meeting, came home with his hat in his hand, and there was never a summit meeting. They never even had the gavel. And that's what Kennedy was walking into.
Whoa.
And he was also walking into a fully operative plan for an invasion of Cuba in the spring of '61, with Richard Nixon assuming he was the point man on it, with the primary assumption that he was going to get elected. And Dulles, whether being devious or on the rare occasion trying to do something honest, but he briefed Kennedy before the debates about exactly where we were in terms of stuff we were doing in the world. So Kennedy knew there was an invasion coming, and he threw it at Nixon like, hey, if you're elected, what are you going to do about this problem in Cuba? Nixon couldn't answer because he knew the answer. And Kennedy had him cornered on that. And then the Bay of Pigs comes along, and Kennedy says, what are the chances? CIA said, chances are excellent. And when you read the CIA briefing booklets, they figured the chances were about 1 in 3. But they figured very strongly that if there was a problem, Kennedy would say, well, we're committed and we can't lose, so let's send in the Marines and the Air Force and who knows who. And when it went south, they went to Kennedy, and Kennedy said, no, you got what you asked for. That's not enough. That's all you're going to get. And what that was perceived as was Kennedy canceling operations that were scheduled, but they weren't scheduled. They were hoped for. And then from there, Kennedy disappointed this growing military in Cuba in '61, certainly during the missile crisis, Berlin at the time of the wall and later on, Laos, because Eisenhower wanted boots on the ground, and Kennedy said to his guys, he wanted them, why didn't he do it? But Kennedy wanted a neutral Laotian government, and then when it came to Vietnam, the military came into Kennedy and said, listen, there's been some flooding in Vietnam. We need to send in 205,000 American troops to help with flood relief. And Kennedy just looked at him like, you got to be kidding. You're not getting it. And everybody told Kennedy, if Vietnam starts, we would have 300,000 troops on the ground. And Kennedy says, it's not going to happen. And, of course, he signed national security. He did not sign. He authored. But George Bundy signed NSAM 263, which was the beginning of the withdrawal of the American advisors from Vietnam. And that document was undone before Kennedy was fully cold. It was done in the month of November of '63. And then we had to wait until something as ridiculous as the Gulf of Tonkin with PT boats attacking American destroyers came to pass. And then, Vietnam happened, and an awful lot of people got rich. 8,000 fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters going down right and left. Just the cost of Vietnam was, in its day, was the equivalent of what we're spending daily in the Middle East. And it's going to the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned about and Kennedy wanted no part of. And
even right now,
a lot of other people believe, and I think I got the sense of it in your book, that if Kennedy had continued as president, the war industry would have been tamped down a little bit.
Oh, I believe so, for sure. Definitely.
And that's the critical factor. And, well, the mob was involved. Well, when you can tell me 5 other major politicians that they killed to get their way, I'll listen. But the military was absolutely involved, and they were all over Dallas.
Well, what do you think of the idea that Johnson could have been involved because he was from Texas, and during World War II, cities like Dallas, that's when they really started to take off because of the entire war industry that you're talking about. Texas wouldn't have been the same thing without it. And Johnson was connected to various defense contractors, that Brown and Root Company.
When he was president, well, the two most famous phrases in the space industry are, one giant step for mankind, Neil Armstrong, but the other one is, Houston, we may have a problem.
Yeah.
You sit back and say to yourself, wait a minute, they shoot the rockets off on the beach in Florida, but they talked to Texas. Well, they talked to Texas because of LBJ. He was made the point man of NASA as vice president. Kennedy did not want a vice president just sitting around waiting to do something, so he gave Johnson a lot of jobs. And what ultimately came to pass was Johnson using that money for pork, not just in the space industry, but in the aircraft industry as well. The F-111 was an absolute fiasco, but Texas made a fortune off it. And when you see who the people are Secretary of State, I believe, Fred Korth, who was the Secretary of the Navy, who's got his fingers in the pie, and the chairman of the board of all of that is a guy named Albert Jenner, who was one of the chief counsel for the Warren Commission. But as far as Johnson being involved before the rifles fire, I'm not convinced. In the sense of planning it, his obligation was keep it quiet, and he and his neighbor J. Edgar had no problem doing that. But deep down, Lyndon Johnson was a coward.
Yeah,
he was publicly, when he had the opportunity, he was a bully. His vice president, the one time when he got elected, his vice president was Hubert Humphrey. The one time on the Senate floor, he told Humphrey to go get something in a hurry, and Humphrey looked at him like, "What's the big hurry?" Johnson reared back and kicked him in the shins and said, "Get going." Yeah, politics makes strange bedfellows. But in the 1960 campaign, Johnson did nothing until the Democrats got together in Los Angeles in July. A sizable group of Democratic advisors, policymakers, the guys that get president, they gathered around Lyndon Johnson as early as 1958. And he got invitations to speak here, there, and everywhere. And his office would accept them, and then they'd say, Grand Forks, North Dakota, next Tuesday, no, cancel that. And he had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, and he refused them. And gradually, these political advisors, we're not going to spend the time that we're putting in to get you nominated or elected. And they drifted off to essentially Hubert Humphrey. And meantime, Kennedy was crisscrossing the country in his private jet to Caroline, and he was building massive numbers of IOUs to the point where when it came to the convention, between Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, they knew every delegate to the Democratic Convention. So if Hubert Humphrey walks in and somebody walks over, Humphrey's got to look at the guy's name tag and say, oh, Joe Smith from Nevada, yeah, I'm Hubert Humphrey. Kennedy would walk over to the guy and say, Smitty, how's your daughter doing at the University of Michigan? They had the book on him from professionalism. But LBJ did not announce his candidacy until he arrived in Los Angeles, because any publicly announced candidate automatically goes into the primary elections in certain states. And Johnson was afraid he was going to be put into primaries, Indiana, Oregon, and a couple others, where he'd lose. And he was afraid of losing, so he stayed completely out of the whole run-up. And then he challenges Kennedy to a debate in front of the Texas delegation while they were in Los Angeles. And Johnson's, patting himself on the back for doing this and doing that. And Kennedy really said almost nothing. He just said, you heard all about the good stuff about Mr. Johnson, and I'm all in favor of absolutely endorsing him for being reelected to the Senate. And I got a big laugh, and that was the end of it. But Johnson, I've read the books that say it was Johnson that did it, and I can't believe them. I mean, there's a lot of factual inaccuracies to a certainty, but just an understanding of Lyndon Johnson. He grew up dead poor. He would have hated John Kennedy. Just if there was one thing John Kennedy wasn't, it was poor. And they exact opposites. And it's an interesting and open question as to how Johnson wound up on the ticket. Supposedly to pull some Southern electors for the Democratic ticket. But then in October, when Martin Luther King gets arrested in Georgia, and they knew, I think it was Georgia. They knew if he was even put in jail for a couple of nights, he'd be killed. So Robert Kennedy called up and said, listen, Senator Kennedy is going to be president, and you don't want to lose your defense contract, so you'd be better off letting Mr. King, Dr. King, make bail. And it saved his life. And that won the black vote for Kennedy, which he got 87% of, but it lost a lot of the southern vote. So you have to wonder, if LBJ was on the ticket for the southern vote, or if he was on the ticket because J. Edgar Hoover could blackmail Kennedy's father, which is a serious possibility. How serious, we'll never know, because Hoover's files were destroyed before he was cold. So you have a non-warlike president going up against a war industry government. And the confrontation is you can't miss it. During the missile crisis, one of the Joint Chiefs said, look, we could destroy the Soviet Union with a first strike. They might be able to launch a handful of missiles or send a handful of bombers. America might have to take 25 to 35 million casualties. Kennedy got walked out. And he was serious about the whole concept. And of course, what they never tell you is what would the attack, us attacking Russia, what would it involve? During the missile crisis, particularly U.S. News and World Report showed the disparity in nuclear weaponry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was lopsided, badly lopsided. Could we have destroyed? Yeah, we could have destroyed them without batting an eyelash. But the fallout, the radioactive fallout, would have killed the populations of Pakistan, India, Indonesia, China, and Japan, which were probably the 5 most populated countries in the world at that time. And that's 1.5 billion people. And Kennedy was up to speed on all this stuff, and one day he had a science advisor in his office, and he said, tell me something, what is fallout? And it was raining. And the science advisor, Jerome Wiesner, pointed outside. He said, that's fallout.
Mm.
You mean that's fallout? The stuff goes up into the clouds, it falls down as rain. It gets into the soil, the grass grows, the cows eat it, our children are eating radioactive milk. And that was a revelation to JFK. And that was the impetus for the test ban treaty, which the military also hated. We didn't need to test the weaponry. We had this stuff. And we keep making them, even though there's no proof whatsoever that nuclear weapons go stale.
Well, I've seen it suggested recently that all those tests back then actually made people get more cancer all around the world than they do today.
Oh, sure. Sure. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, 4 or 5 days later, you could pick up a newspaper and it would say, the American population is upset because 300 Americans were killed at Pearl Harbor. Well, anybody with 10 cents worth of sense or knowledge knew the Arizona went down with all hands, and that was 1,100 guys right there.
Yeah.
I mean, they're saying 300, but they meant to say well over 3,000. And then 4 years later, when Hiroshima was hit, they said, well, there were probably 50,000 killed, but there was more like 400,000. And people were dying from cancer cancer, it's different kinds, for years after 1945. But I don't think one American in 500 has ever seen any of the real videos from Hiroshima, which are horrible. If you're not the kind of person that can diet well, watch one of those videos. You won't eat for a couple of days. It's horrible what happened. And I'm not saying it wasn't necessary. That's a debate for experts beyond my expertise. But we downplayed it. We made it important enough that it was a big thing we did, and Joseph Stalin better watch out now. But it wasn't so big that we were monsters. So there was probably a preconceived understanding of how many were going to be killed before the bombs even got out to the island of Tinian.
Well, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Curtis LeMay, he was head, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was the one in charge of doing all this bombing in World War II. So,
yeah,
his
aircraft reduced Tokyo to ashes. You could stand at one end of Tokyo and wave to somebody at the other end, and there's nothing between the two of you but Tokyo, because the buildings were gone. So much of it was wood and paper.
But people, listen to us that it's crazy, but 9/11 now is 17 years ago, or 18, and there's people.
17 and a half.
It's crazy, So there's many people, born after 9/11, and when I was a child in the 1980s, I was afraid of nuclear war. The Cold War to me was real. And there are movies all about it, in the 80s, and I'd watch old Twilight Zone episodes.
Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe. It was hyped. And the reality was the Russians didn't have the weaponry to challenge us. And we knew what they did during World War II. And one of the things they did, even though they knew there was going to be mass starvation in Leningrad, the best, arguably the finest Russian art museum is the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad. And the Russians used hundreds of railroad trains to save the paintings and the statuary and all of the art that was in that museum, leaving behind 1 million people that starved in Leningrad when the Nazis had it surrounded. And thereafter, and I visited the Hermitage when I was in St. Petersburg, which is Leningrad renamed. We went to the trouble of spying. The United States, the CIA, constantly had intelligence people watching places like the Hermitage. Because if all of a sudden 1,000 trucks show up to empty out the paintings, maybe the Russians are going to attack us. And maybe we should hit them first. But, we were just looking for trouble, and Kennedy kept trying to stay out of it. LeMay and certainly others wanted to just bomb Cuba off the map. And Kennedy says, well, what happens when the Russians that are there get killed? And two, can you guarantee that you can hit all the missiles? And the answer was no. A lot of them were on mobile launchers. So no, we can't guarantee we'll get them all. Okay, then we're not going to take that option. And they were just itching to be rid of them. And as I said, Dealey Plaza was ripe with military intelligence for reasons
This was when he was arrested, right? In jail.
Yeah, he was in jail Saturday night, and he asked to have a call made to North Carolina to someone named Hurt, who was a muck in military intelligence, and the people at the Dallas police station were told, don't put the call through, just tell them it's ringing, it's ringing, it's ringing, and that was it. The next day he was dead. And I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with a letter that turned up a dozen years after the assassination, and it looks like, Dear Mr. Hunt, blah, 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 Lee Oswald, and he misspelled his middle name. If you look at that letter could be written to Dear Mr. Hurt, not Hunt. But there was a military intelligence guy right across the corner from the book depository, James Powell, who had spent time in the 1950s trying to buy oil leases in Cuba along with somebody named George de Mohrenschildt, so that the United States had so much financial interest in Cuba besides just casinos that if some revolutionary came in, we would have an excuse to send in the troops, kick out the revolutionary, and set up some puppet, like we did in the Dominican Republic, like we did with Mossadegh, like we did with Arbenz in Guatemala, like we did with the brothers in Vietnam 3 weeks before Kennedy was killed. It was a pattern. It was pre-drawn, preset, but they didn't succeed in getting the oil leases. Then when they bring in Mrs. Oswald to talk to her that afternoon, they have to get a translator. Who gets the translator but a guy named Jack Crichton, who was military intelligence and just happened to be hanging around police headquarters. In the movie JFK, Oliver Stone's movie, it was all about, well, the Army stood down that day, the people that would have, been on the motorcade route. The two guys that were in charge of the East Texas National Guard were 2 cars ahead of Kennedy, Lumpkin and Whitmire. For the 2 guys that would have been responsible for a military presence.
Well, that Lumpkin guy is curious to me because he was a captain in the police department.
Yes,
and
deputy chief.
And he goes to Parkland, with everyone else, and then goes straight to the book depositories. And I think he was in charge of sealing it off and took charge of it.
Well, if he was, he did it way too late because by going to Parkland and getting back, 100 people could have escaped.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's transmissions on the DPD radio asking, is the building sealed? And at 1:30, and they're saying, we're taking care of that now. Well, don't worry about the barn. The horse is gone. But yeah, Lumpkin was deputy chief, and the other guy was strictly military intelligence, and military intelligence had visited Ruth Payne and Marina Oswald 3 days before Dallas.
Now I wonder if there's a record of what that was about. Not that I know of.
Well, the guy's name was J.D. Wilmot, W-I-L-M-E-T-H. And he claimed he had a curiosity about the Russian language, and he wanted to hear how somebody who had been born in Archangel, the way Americans say it, Archangel, he wanted to hear somebody from that region speak because of the dialect. Well, the reality was J.D. Wilmot had a Ph.D. in Russian, and he had been stationed at the Russian legation, the American legation in Moscow in 1944. He'd been a well-established spy. And I am convinced, and I've heard it from a source, but until that source comes out publicly with it, I'm just passing along hearsay till it's made public. But supposedly, he went to see them, basically to say, listen, ladies, Lee Oswald, the world is going to fall on top of Lee Oswald real soon. Now, if you want to defend him, that's fine. The world's going to fall on top of you too. If you want to help us convict him or help us put more weight on the globe that he's carrying, then play along. And boy, Ruth Payne and Maria Oswald certainly did. So that little get-together was a success. And it's rarely noticed, even though it's in the Warren volumes. Michael Payne talked about it in the Warren volumes. And one of the there was a damage assessment team on the ground in Dealey Plaza. There was a missionary named Robert Croft, C-R-O-F-T, and he'd gone on missionary duty to Arkansas, and he was coming home, going home from Arkansas to Colorado by train. His train stopped in Union Station, Dallas, 3 blocks south of Dealey Plaza at noon. It was a 1-hour layover. And he says, what am I going to do for an hour in Dallas, Texas? And somebody said, well, listen, the president's having a motorcade right up the street. You know, okay, wow, that's great. We had this camera, ran up to Dealey Plaza, took 4 photographs of the motorcade, one of which he believed coincided with Zapruder Frame 313. Then he looks at his watch, sees all these people running around going crazy, and he says, oh man, I got to get back down and catch my train. Off he goes. Takes the train to Colorado. Gets off the train the next morning, 7, 8 o'clock. The FBI read his door at 10 o'clock in the morning saying, we want your pictures. How did they know? The only way they knew is somebody saw him taking those pictures, followed him onto that train. When he got to Colorado, dropped the dime. Our boy is here. And the FBI took his pictures, and they returned. They took 4 pictures. They believed there was 4 pictures on the roll. What he got back was 3 pictures.
Mm.
But it's symptomatic of a presence. James Powell standing across from the front door of the depository. Well, what's he doing there? Real simple. He's got to make sure that Oswald doesn't leave. He doesn't go outside to get a hot dog. And when the 2 military guys, 2 cars in front of Kennedy, when they turn the corner, while Kennedy is still on Main Street, they pull over, ostensibly because there had been an epileptic there. But I think they were pulling over to look at Powell, and Powell just put a thumb up, and then they knew Oswald was in the building. Let's go, guys. And the rest is unwritten history, except in the Kennedy execution, thank you very much, which I recently tweaked, and there's going to be a new edition soon, and I'm excited about it.
Well, if people want to, I don't think it's available on Amazon, so if people want to...
It is, but
oh.
It's the last couple... I lose a lot of money. You're buying it from Amazon from me.
Okay.
My email is K, as in Kennedy, K-I-A-S, as in Sam, K-I-A-S, JFK at AOL. And they want to write to me. I'll tell them how to order. If the new edition is available, they'll save a little money because it's going to be cheaper than the older edition. It's a good story. And it needs to be read.
Oh, it's fantastic. And when I had that conversation with Chuck Ocelli, I first suggested the book by James Douglas, JFK and the Unspeakable, for someone that's, if that's the one book to read that. But then I paused and said your book, because the JFK and Unspeakable book, it does a good job of talking.
It's great.
It's a great book, but it has some things in it that I wouldn't put, I think are mistaken. And I think your book, his book really does not do what yours does, which is really, I think, get the closest to really solving this that's possible so far.
I've read Douglas's book twice, and I think he hints at what I came out and said.
But you say it also with evidence. You show why you say that. And you do it more so in the book than even you've done talking. Right now.
And for people that have read any of my stuff, and over 25 years plus, I've gotten all kinds of snail mail, emails, phone calls, you name it. I love your books, the wit, the sarcasm, the humor. There's not as much wit, sarcasm, and humor in the Kennedy execution. There's a little when it's needed, but it's too deadly serious to be frivolous with in any way. And I'm not going to apologize for less sarcasm. It had to be the way it was. It's just straightforward, and every page is like the fullback going through the line.
Well, in a way, when I've got first interested in this topic in the 1980s, all these books were exploding everywhere. The mob did it, Hoover did it, LBJ did it, anti-Castro people did it, and so forth. And there are no books that pinned it on the people you did, and in a way, it's a lot more disturbing.
Well, I did People v. Oswald first, which was just, here's what I think would have happened at a trial.
Mm-hmm.
Treachery in Dallas it got butchered at the publisher's office, unfortunately. But it had some good messages in it that were different, certainly, from the trial of Lee Oswald. Then you got Warren Omission, and that just focuses on how did the Warren Commission go wrong by intent, and look what they got away with. And then, I did a quiz book. I did a couple of indices, 32,000 pages of chronology, and then finally Kennedy execution, and that's it. In the last couple of years, I've done 5 mysteries, whodunits. They're a lot of fun, a lot of sarcasm, but each one, I got to say, each one has a Kennedy suggestion in it. Each one, but that's it, and you have to look for it. But Kennedy execution, I'll stand by. And I read the stuff that comes out now, and most, not all, most of what's coming out now is just self-published rubbish with no discernible research. Trust me, folks, with no depth of knowledge, with witnesses, in quotes, that just suddenly appeared on the scene 55 years after the fact. There's no room for that. There's just no room for that. And it's the loss of President Kennedy was a tragedy, certainly to me as a 16-year-old, and certainly to this country. And initially, Oswald was this Castro communist, but within 2 days, that went away because America wasn't angry enough at Kennedy's loss to say, fire the rockets. We were just in the depths of a horrible tragedy. And when I read some of this stuff, it's just god-awful rubbish. To me, that it taints the memory of John Kennedy, and it's in a way, it's insulting to a lot of people who have done good, honest research. And there are some are gone. Mark Lane's gone. Harold Weisberg's gone. But there are still people out there working hard and doing good, honest work, and I got to respect them.
Oh, for sure, but it's tough. Like you're saying, there's such a flood of garbage, not just on Amazon, but on YouTube and everywhere on the internet, that the good work is just getting drowned out. I mean, the only person that I can think of that's written a book recently that uses any of the new files that came out 2 years ago is John Newman. But other than him, I can't think of anyone else.
No, I know I read Talbot's book and I read Jefferson Morley's books, which were kind of tangential.
Yeah.
About the intelligence agencies, and they were well done and they were worked on. But as far as the files go, boys and girls are not going to find anything. Anything that was damaging went away in the shredder long ago, and the excuses are so ridiculous. A file can't be released if it's got a name in it, and the name, that person could somehow still be compromised. Well, it's been 56 years. So who's going to be compromised? Well, when they stalled the release in 2017, the excuse was when Oswald was in Mexico, if in fact he was in Mexico, when Oswald was in Mexico, the CIA had a bunch of teenagers following him around. All right, so take those teenagers and add 54 years, and they could still be alive. But I would have a hard time imagining opening a Mexico City phone book and looking up Juan Lopez and finding the one guy that followed Oswald, because I'm sure there's 40 pages of Juan Lopez. So it's absurd. But it's the government saying, here it is. And sad to say, but we got too many people in this country that no matter what the government says, they nod their head up and down like bobblehead dolls. And they're making a mistake to do it.
Well, I mean...
And they're empowering the government to keep on doing it.
Well, it's a whole other topic, but we live in some crazy times, that's for sure. I mean, when the files, some of those files were released in 2017, Trump made it sound like he released all of them in a tweet. And that's what he's got media friends that Alex Jones did shows saying all the files are out. And of course, it wasn't true.
Not true. And but the people that listen to outlets like that would tend to believe it.
Yeah.
Because it's a certain gospel being propagated in almost a worship situation, and it is what it is. We can't change it. All we can do is say, hey, listen, everybody, I'm convinced that there are still secrets tucked away from the War of 1812. And when I see that the Ark of the Covenant being wheeled into that big warehouse at the end of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark,
yeah.
I see that, I said, there's the Kennedy stuff in there somewhere. Because our government just isn't forthcoming. And it's not going to be forthcoming. Simply because our education system has been badly dumbed down. That's a talk for another whole time. Our economy, for all that it's touted, 4 in 10 people in the United States, if they were handed a bill for $400, they would be in financial trouble. And that's unimaginable in this country. You know, with the wealth we have, and all of a sudden you need new tires on your car and can't afford them, unimaginable. 2 people in 10 in this country have no savings. It's also unimaginable. But it's the way it is. And those kind of folks are not, they're not going to go out in the street with a placard and say, tell me the truth, please. They're just hoping that the world doesn't fall on them. And it's sad, but it is what it is. And everybody in this country should be thankful that we're not living in some places in this world where you wouldn't want to be dropped for an hour.
Well, if it wasn't for President Kennedy and what he did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we'd all be dead, or we wouldn't be born.
Yeah. Well, it would have been ugly. could have been ugly. And, of course, Khrushchev had gone out on a limb with his peace initiative, and there have been documents released since 1996 in the Soviet archives, and their archives are archives. Everything they have is in literally cold storage, in refrigerated rooms. I found that out when I went to Moscow. But it was discovered that Brezhnev fully intended in 1964 to have Khrushchev killed.
Wow.
And because Kennedy had been killed, if the two of them, who were, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, those two men were exchanging metaphoric letters. Just, boy, I looked out today and saw the flowers blooming the first day of spring, and you could smell the warm air, and what a wonderful thing to see and be part of. You know, hint, let's not destroy it. They were exchanging those letters for a year after the missile crisis. The last letter from Khrushchev never got to Kennedy in October of '63. And why it didn't, I don't know, but it didn't. But if both men who were working hand in hand to calm things down, they'd both been killed, somebody might have tumbled to the fact that it was more than just a lone nut in an upper floor with a cheap gun. So instead, Khrushchev got put out to pasture. And Brezhnev, who was a gangster to begin with, and Kosygin, who was an able administrator, they came in and took over.
And the Cold War went on.
Yeah, and the day Reagan was shot, the end of March 1981, the bullet just killed him by a quarter, half an inch after it hit the limousine. For a half an inch, we were a half an inch away from the two superpowers of the world being governed by the former head of the CIA, George H.W. Bush, and the former head of the KGB, Andropov. That's a little scary.
They're creepy people, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the KGB, for what it's worth, is gone now, but it was the most efficient killing machine in intelligence circles ever. Far more dangerous than Hitler's Gestapo, certainly more dangerous than the CIA, which isn't all that dangerous. But they were efficient at what they did. And one of these days we're going to have a talk about World War II. And one of the things that you marvel at in World War II is that even though the Soviets were losing millions of soldiers, they always had enough NKVD, which became the KGB. They always had enough NKVD soldiers to police the population and the army. They never let that get put aside. And it was the same thing on the German side. Goebbels always had thousands of guys to read every letter that came home from the Eastern Front. Because no bad news could get through. And if the news was bad enough, they'd find the guy who wrote it and put him up against a wall. So that's our world. And it's not a pretty picture. But at least, I think, people reading County Execution will get a sense of where America was politically in 1963 and where it was militarily in 1963. And it was a rock and a hard place.
Well, as we wrap up, if you could, I don't want to put this on my website or in text, your email address, because I'm afraid spam robots or something will find it. So if you could just tell people your email address so they can know how to contact you to get the book.
Yeah, it's K as in Kennedy, KIAS as in Sam, JFK at AOL.com. The other one is WRITE, right, N
And I recommend everyone who's listening, contact you and get the book. And hopefully in a month or two or at some point we'll do an interview about World War II, because you got a chronology about that too. And I want to get a copy of it. Actually, I need to get a copy of it before we do that.
Yeah, we'll talk.
Okay.
That will be probably a lot more fun than this one was, because we can laugh at some of that crazy stuff that happened. And thank God that it wasn't you and me and the listeners having to go through what that war in the Eastern Front entailed. That was a horror.
Yeah, unbelievable, really.
A horror. Thank you to everyone who's listened. I hope you've learned something today. There's a lot more to be learned, either in the chronology or Kennedy execution, or wherever you can find what you need to know.
Well, thanks a lot.